Clint Eastwood was never the kind to let injustice slide, neither on screen nor in real life. So, when he learned about Marine veteran Byron and his devoted service dog being denied their flight, he knew he had to act. Mark Reynolds tightened his grip on the leash, his fingers unconsciously tracing the worn leather as he stood in the airport terminal. Right beside him, his golden retriever, Charlie, sat alert, ears perked, sensing his handler's unease. Mark had witnessed a lot over the years: combat zones, life-or-death situations, the immense weight of responsibility. But this was a different kind of fight, one he never saw coming. The journey had already been long. Mark had spent months preparing for this trip, eagerly anticipating the chance to visit his sister, Angela, in Texas. She had been his rock, always there since he returned home, trying to adjust to civilian life after years of active duty. And Charlie was more than just a service dog. He was his anchor, trained to detect panic before it fully took hold, to sense the nightmares creeping in before they took over. He was family. So, when the airline attendant at the check-in counter shook her head and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't allow your dog to board," Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. He blinked, certain he had misheard. What? The woman behind the desk, her face apologetic yet firm, motioned to the computer screen. "Your ticket was booked under our standard passenger fare, and we don't have documentation that Charlie is a registered service dog." Mark felt the slow, simmering burn of frustration rise in his chest. He had submitted everything, in advance, and followed every regulation to the letter. He wasn't new to this process. "That's a mistake," he said evenly. "I sent all the paperwork last week. Charlie is a fully trained and certified service animal." "I understand, sir, but without the documents in our system, we can't make an exception." Charlie, sensing the tension, nudged Mark's leg with his nose. The Marine took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had faced far greater challenges than an airport's bureaucratic mix-up, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. Behind him, the line was growing, a quiet murmur of impatience spreading. A middle-aged woman sighed loudly. A businessman checked his watch. Mark ignored them. His focus was locked onto the attendant, who was already glancing at the next customer in line. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "I can call one, but I can't promise they'll be able to change anything," she replied. "Please do." As the woman turned to make the call, Mark's grip on Charlie's leash tightened. He had been through this before: the skepticism, the extra scrutiny. Not all wounds were visible, and not everyone understood what a dog like Charlie meant to someone like him. But denying them access to their flight? That wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. Minutes passed before a man in a crisp airline uniform approached, wearing that kind of polite, pre-decided smile. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand there's an issue with your service animal," he said smoothly. "Yeah, there's an issue," Mark replied. "I submitted all the required paperwork, and now I'm being told Charlie isn't allowed to fly. That's unacceptable." The man sighed. "I understand this is frustrating, but airline policy requires verification of all service animals before boarding. We don't have your paperwork on file." Mark clenched his jaw. "And that's my fault?" The man hesitated. "Unfortunately, without the proper documentation, we can't allow." "That's ridiculous," came a voice from behind. A deep, unmistakable voice. One that instantly silenced the growing crowd. Mark turned, his eyebrows drawing together in surprise. Standing just a few feet away, Clint Eastwood. Even in his 80s, the legendary actor and director commanded attention, his piercing gaze locked onto the airline representative. Dressed casually, yet carrying nothing casual about his presence. He radiated authority. The airline supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Eastwood, You mean to tell me," Clint said slowly, voice deliberate, "that this Marine, who fought for his country, can't board his flight because of a clerical error? And that this dog, who is clearly well trained, is somehow a problem?" The tension in the air thickened. Passengers, who had only been bystanders a moment ago, now murmured among themselves. Mark felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. Of all people, Clint Eastwood. The supervisor swallowed hard. "Sir, it's not about denying anyone's service, it's just..." "Just what?" Clint's eyes narrowed. "A dog like that isn't just a pet. He's a partner. His protection. I don't know what kind of rules you're following, but they're the wrong ones." Mark had faced down superior officers with less intensity than what Clint was giving this poor airline worker. The supervisor cleared his throat. I need to check with corporate." "You do that," Clint said, arms crossed. "And while you're at it, tell them I'd like a word." The supervisor gave a quick, nervous nod before hurrying away. By now, the crowd around them was practically buzzing, a mix of awe and curiosity. Mark glanced at Clint, still trying to wrap his head around how this was even happening. "You didn't have to do that," Mark finally said. Clint shrugged. "I don't like seeing good men pushed around, and I sure as hell don't like seeing a veteran disrespected." Charlie, as if sensing the shift in energy, wagged his tail and nudged Clint's hand. The actor smirked, reaching down to scratch behind the golden retriever's ears. "Good dog," he murmured. Minutes stretched on as they waited for the supervisor's return. Mark could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on them, passengers whispering excitedly, some even discreetly raising their phones to snap photos. Finally, the airline worker reappeared, looking even more flustered than before. "Sir, we've spoken with management and—" He hesitated, his eyes flickering to Clint. "Your paperwork has been located. You and your service dog are cleared to board." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the crowd. Mark exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "Thank you." Clint's face remained unreadable, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Looks like you're good to go." Mark gave Charlie a quick scratch behind the ears. "Guess we are." As they made their way toward security, Mark couldn't help but shake his head in disbelief. He had braced himself for frustration, maybe even a long battle with airline bureaucracy, but Clint Eastwood stepping in to fight for him? He sure hadn't seen that coming, and something told him this wasn't over yet. Even as they neared the security checkpoint, Mark still felt the weight of the encounter pressing on his chest. Charlie walked steadily beside him, golden fur brushing against Mark's leg, as if sensing the lingering tension. Most of the crowd had dispersed, but a few onlookers still stole glances, murmuring about what had just happened. Mark ignored them. His focus was on one thing, getting through security and onto that plane. Beside him, Clint walked in silence for a moment. Then, as they reached the TSA line, the actor glanced down at Charlie, then back at Mark. "You doing all right?" Mark let out a breath, trying to shake off the frustration still coiled inside him. "Yeah. Just tired of fighting battles I shouldn't have to fight." Clint nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the security line ahead. "I get it. Bureaucracy is its own kind of war. But you handled yourself well." Mark managed a small smile, grateful for the words, even if he wasn't sure he believed them. They stepped forward. A TSA agent motioned for Mark to remove his belt and place his belongings into a plastic tray. Charlie sat patiently, tail thumping lightly against the floor, waiting for his turn. The agent eyed the dog with mild apprehension. "You'll need to step to the side for additional screening," he said, gesturing toward a separate area. Mark sighed but nodded, used to the process by now. He gave Charlie a reassuring pat before following the agent's instructions. The TSA officer performed a routine check, swabbing Mark's hands before carefully inspecting Charlie's harness. The dog remained perfectly still, his training impeccable. But Mark could sense Charlie's alert. Always. That silent understanding between them never wavered, a bond built on necessity and trust. When the agent finally gave the all-clear, Mark clipped Charlie's leash back on and merged back into the main line, where Clint stood waiting, his expression unreadable. "All good." "Yeah, just the usual checks." Clint studied him for a beat before giving a small nod. "Let's get you on that plane." As they made their way toward the gate, Mark found himself stealing glances at the Hollywood legend beside him. It was surreal. Clint Eastwood, of all people, casually walking through an airport with him. He still wasn't sure why the actor had stepped in earlier, but one thing was certain. He was grateful. They reached the gate with time to spare, but the tension hadn't completely faded. Approaching the desk cautiously, Mark half expected another roadblock. The same airline supervisor from before stood behind the counter, posture stiff as Mark stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds," the man addressed him, voice carefully measured. "I just wanted to personally apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. Your service animal is, of course, permitted to fly, and we've made sure all the necessary notes are in the system." Mark gave a slow nod. "Appreciate that." The supervisor hesitated, then glanced at Clint. "Also, Mr. Eastwood, I just want to say, it's an honor. Huge fan." Clint barely reacted, giving only a slight nod. "Glad to hear it. Now, how about you make sure he and his dog get on that plane without any more trouble?" "Of course, sir." The supervisor straightened. "We've also upgraded you to first class, Mr. Reynolds, as a courtesy." Mark raised a brow. "That really necessary?" "It's our way of making things right," the man insisted. Mark wasn't about to argue, not when exhaustion was already settling deep in his bones. "All right. Thanks." Boarding passes in hand, Mark and Charlie moved toward the jet bridge, Clint walking with them. When they reached the entrance to the plane, the actor stopped. "Looks like this is where I leave you." Mark turned, feeling an unexpected pang of regret. "Didn't take you for a first-class guy." Clint smirked. "Had my share of plane rides. Besides, this was your fight. I just gave it a push in the right direction." Mark extended a hand, and Clint shook it firmly. "I appreciate it. More than you know." Clint gave Charlie one last scratch behind the ears before stepping back. "Take care of yourself, Marine." Mark nodded, then stepped onto the plane, Charlie trotting beside him. Finally, the tension in his shoulders started to ease. First class was a welcome surprise. Spacious seating, a calm hum of the cabin, worlds apart from the chaos outside. Charlie curled up at Mark's feet, resting his head on his boot as the plane prepared for takeoff. Mark gazed out the window, his mind replaying the past hour. He had expected a simple flight. Instead, he'd ended up in the middle of a pointless battle. And if Clint Eastwood hadn't stepped in, who knew how long it would have taken to sort things out? Reaching down, Mark ran his fingers through Charlie's fur. "We're almost there, buddy. Just a few more hours." Charlie sighed contentedly, his tail giving a single lazy thump against the floor. Mark allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, exhaustion finally settling in. He wasn't sure what awaited him in Texas, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering drinks and warm towels. Mark barely registered any of it. His thoughts had already begun to drift. Memories surfaced, his time overseas, the weight of a rifle in his hands, the relentless sand and heat, the faces of friends. Some who had made it back, some who hadn't. Charlie shifted, pressing his head closer to Mark's leg. A grounding force. A reminder that he was here, not there. The plane rumbled as it began its ascent, engines humming beneath them. Mark exhaled slowly, watching as the city lights disappeared beneath the clouds. For so long, he had been trying to adjust, trying to navigate a world that no longer felt the same. But maybe, just maybe, things were starting to fall into place. As the plane leveled off, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Can I get you anything?" Mark shook his head. "I'm good, thanks." She nodded, then glanced down at Charlie. "He's a beautiful dog." Mark smiled, for what felt like the first time that day. "Yeah, he's the best." Charlie perked up at the sound of his name, tail wagging lightly. The flight attendant chuckled before moving on, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts once more. He still had a long way to go. The battles weren't over. But at least, for now, he was moving forward. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign woke Mark, signaling turbulence ahead. The dim glow of the cabin lights barely illuminated the space around him. For a split second, he had to remind himself where he was. Then he felt it, Charlie's warm presence at his feet, grounding him, keeping him here. His fingers instinctively ran through the golden retriever's soft fur, the rhythmic rise and fall of Charlie's breathing grounding him in a way that words never could. The plane gave a slight shudder, and Mark exhaled slowly, trying to keep himself steady. Flying had never been an issue before, not for him. He'd been in and out of military aircraft more times than he could count, but something about the stillness of commercial flights always felt off, unsettling. Maybe it was the lack of purpose. Maybe it was the memories, the ones that had a way of creeping in when there was nothing to do but sit and wait. Charlie shifted beside him, lifting his head as if sensing his unease. Mark offered a quiet smile. "I'm all right, buddy. Just a little rattled." A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Everything okay?" He glanced up to see the flight attendant from earlier standing beside his seat. Her expression wasn't full of pity, just simple concern. "Yeah, just not a big fan of turbulence," Mark admitted. She nodded, her voice gentle. "It should pass soon. Let me know if you need anything." Mark appreciated the offer. Really, he did. But what he needed, what he truly needed, was something no one could give him. Peace. Peace from the thoughts that surfaced when the world got too quiet. He gave a small nod of thanks, and the flight attendant moved on, tending to other passengers. For a moment, he envied them. Their worries, missed meetings, delayed arrivals, maybe even a fear of flying. But nothing like the weight sitting heavy on his own shoulders. Shaking his head, he forced himself to focus on the present. The plane steadied. The turbulence faded into a smooth glide. Mark let out a slow breath, rubbing Charlie's ears absent-mindedly. The dog's tail gave a slow, lazy wag, his own quiet way of saying, "We're good. We're safe." Mark's gaze drifted around the cabin. Passengers were lost in their own worlds, scrolling through their phones, dozing off with heads pressed against the windows. A man a few rows ahead chuckled quietly to himself, watching a movie, a world that kept moving, even when he felt like he was standing still. Just as he leaned back into his seat, a tap on his shoulder made him turn. He looked up, meeting the sharp blue eyes of a middle-aged man, salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. "Hey, I saw what happened back at the gate," the man said, curiosity in his voice. "That was a mess. You handled it well." Mark wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. "Thanks." The man extended a hand. "David Lawson, former Air Force." Mark took it, shaking firmly. "Mark Reynolds, Marines." David's eyes lit up with recognition. "SF." Mark gave a small smirk. "Yup." It wasn't often he ran into someone who just got it, someone who understood without needing an explanation. David gestured toward Charlie. "Beautiful dog. How long have you had him?" 3 years now." "He's been through a lot with me." David nodded, admiration in his gaze. "Good dogs like that. They make all the difference. I had one when I got back home. Didn't realize how much I needed him until he was there." Mark knew exactly what he meant. "Yeah. He keeps me steady." A comfortable silence settled between them, two men who had walked different battlefields but carried the same weight. No words were needed. After a moment, David leaned back, resting his hands on his lap. "So, heading home or visiting?" "Visiting my sister in Texas," Mark replied. "Haven't seen her in a while." David smiled. "Family's important. Good you're making the trip." Mark nodded but didn't say more. He wasn't sure how much he wanted to share, not even with someone who understood. David didn't press, and for that, Mark was grateful. As the flight continued, the two exchanged stories in pieces, not diving too deep, just enough to acknowledge the roads they had traveled. Mark rarely let his guard down, but something about this conversation made it easier. Charlie lay between them, content just being close. The hours passed. The plane moved steadily through the dark sky. Mark drifted in and out of sleep, his body exhausted, but his mind unwilling to shut down completely. Memories crept in. Hot desert winds, the steady hum of a convoy engine, the weight of a rifle in his hands. They came and went, like shadows that never fully disappeared. Charlie stirred, pressing his head against Mark's leg. Mark jolted awake. The cabin was quieter now, most passengers lost in sleep. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the lingering fog of memory. David was watching, not with pity, but with understanding. "You good?" Mark hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just." "I know," David said, cutting him off gently. "I get it." Mark appreciated that more than words could say. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself back in the present, the steady hum of the plane, the quiet breathing of Charlie, the silent camaraderie of a fellow veteran beside him. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The intercom crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent into Dallas shortly. Please fasten your seat belts and prepare for landing." Mark sat up straighter, adjusting Charlie's harness. It was almost time. He'd made it this far, and soon he'd be on the ground, one step closer to whatever came next. David reached over, giving his shoulder a firm pat. "If you ever need to talk, brother, you've got a friend." Mark nodded, a real smile breaking through for the first time in a while. "Same to you." The plane began its slow descent, the world below growing closer with every passing second. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt something new, a sense of possibility, something waiting for him, just beyond the horizon. But this journey wasn't over yet. With a soft jolt, the plane touched down. A familiar tension eased from Mark's body as Charlie lifted his head. his tail thumping softly against the floor in quiet relief. The steady hum of the engines faded while the flight crew made their final announcements, and passengers shifted in their seats, preparing to disembark. Mark took a deep breath, grounding himself. The past few hours in the air had been restless, his sleep light, his mind wandering through memories he wasn't always prepared to face. But now, as he got ready to step off the plane, the reality of this visit hit. It had been over a year since he'd last seen Angela. She had always been his biggest supporter, but he knew, no matter how much she tried to hide it, she worried about him. Beside him, David stretched, letting out a satisfied sigh. "Well, we made it," he said, giving Mark a knowing look. "Feels good to be back on solid ground, huh?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, it does." Reaching down, he scratched Charlie behind the ears before rising to his feet. "It was good meeting you, David." "Likewise, brother," David said, offering his hand. "And remember, if you ever need to talk, you've got a friend." Mark shook his hand firmly, appreciating the offer more than words could express. "I'll keep that in mind." The line of passengers inched forward, and before long, Mark stepped onto the jet bridge, the artificial glow of the airport terminal washing over him. Charlie trotted beside him, ears alert but relaxed. As he moved through the terminal, his gaze swept across the crowd, until it landed on her. Angela stood near baggage claim, her face lighting up the second she saw him. Without hesitation, she hurried forward, arms open wide. "Mark," she called, pulling him into a tight embrace. He hugged her back, feeling home in her presence. "It's so good to see you," she murmured. "You too, Angie." She pulled back, giving him a once-over. "You look good." "Tired, but good." Mark smirked. "Long flight." Her gaze shifted to Charlie, and her expression softened. "And this must be Charlie." As if on cue, Charlie wagged his tail and stepped forward, sniffing her hand. Angela crouched down, scratching behind his ears. "I've heard so much about you, but you're even more handsome in person." Mark chuckled. "He likes you already." Straightening, Angela looped her arm through his. "Come on, let's grab your bag and get out of here. Mom's been cooking all day. She's so excited to see you." Mark's chest tightened slightly at the mention of their mother. It had been too long since he'd been home. He knew she was eager to see him, and though he'd never say it out loud, a part of him felt guilty for staying away so long. As they walked, Angela filled him in on family updates, cousins getting married, old neighbors moving away, stories from her job at the hospital. Mark listened, grateful for the normalcy of it all. It was a reminder that life had kept moving, even when he felt like he had been standing still. At baggage claim, he spotted his duffel bag rounding the carousel. He grabbed it effortlessly, slinging it over his shoulder. "Ready?" Angela asked. Mark nodded. "Then let's go home." The drive through the Texas countryside was peaceful. The sun had set, leaving a deep blue glow stretching across the horizon. Mark cracked the window slightly, letting the cool night air fill the car. In the back seat, Charlie rested his head on his paws, content. Angela glanced over. "So, how was the flight?" Aside from the gate debacle, Mark exhaled. "Not too bad, actually. Met another vet on the plane. Guy named David. We talked for a while." Angela smiled. "That's good. It helps to talk to people who get it." Mark nodded but didn't say more. Over the years, he'd learned that while Angela would always be there to listen, some things were just easier left unsaid. Before long, they pulled into the driveway of their childhood home. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow against the night. Before they even reached the front door, it swung open. And there she was. Their mother stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Mark," she called, her voice thick with emotion. Before he could react, she pulled him in, hugging him tight. Mark closed his eyes, allowing himself to be held, letting just a little of the weight on his shoulders fade. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. Pulling back, she cupped his face in her hands. "You look good, baby. I've missed you. I missed you too." Her gaze shifted, landing on Charlie. A smile spread across her face. "And who's this handsome boy?" "Mom, meet Charlie." Ever the gentleman, Charlie sat politely, his tail wagging as she bent down to pet him. "Oh, aren't you just the sweetest thing?" she cooed. "I bet you take good care of my boy." Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "He does." Angela ushered them inside, and the familiar scent of home-cooked food filled the air. Mark's stomach growled, reminding him just how long it had been since his last meal. "Come on, sit down, eat something," their mother insisted, pulling out a chair at the dining table. He didn't argue. Sinking into the chair, he let the warmth of home settle into his bones. Angela took a seat across from him, while their mother set a heaping plate in front of him. "You need to put some weight back on," she fussed. "You're too thin." Mark chuckled. "I'll do my best, Mom." As they ate, conversation flowed effortlessly, laughter filling the room. It felt good, better than he'd expected. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt at ease. Later that night, he stepped outside for some air. Charlie followed, settling beside him on the porch steps. The night was quiet. Only the rustling of trees in the breeze filled the air. A moment later, Angela joined him, 2 steaming mugs in hand. She passed him one, then sat beside him. "It's good to have you home, Mark." Mark took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. "It's good to be home." She hesitated. "Are you staying this time?" He exhaled, eyes drifting toward the dark horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I want to try." Angela smiled, squeezing his arm. "That's all that matters." Charlie nudged against Mark's leg, and he reached down, running his fingers through the soft fur. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just passing through. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. And maybe, just maybe, this was where healing began.